Hola, buenas noches, buenas tardes. Hola Ana, ¿cómo estás?
Hola Manuel, ¿qué tal?
Bueno, muy bien, gracias. Vamos a comenzar con una nueva transmisión de la serie Archivo Redux, que forma parte del programa público de actividades de la Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos de la Universidad Torcuato Di Tella. Archivo Redux es una serie de transmisiones de conferencias y actividades extracurriculares que se han llevado a cabo en la escuela en los últimos años. Está coordinado por Ana Font, que es la coordinadora del Archivo de Arquitectura, y progresivamente ha ido construyendo Ana una taxonomía de las ideas y discursos y sensibilidades y técnicas que están en cada una de estas conferencias. Y hoy vamos a ver la conferencia que dio Jean Lally el 7 de noviembre de 2013, que es The Air from Other Planets.
Claro, sí, gracias Manuel.
Vamos.
Em, ¿Me ves bien? Sí, ¿no?
Sí, sí, perfecto.
Eh, bueno, sí, la conferencia de Sean de 2013, Dear from Other Planets, es en realidad, bueno, es una conferencia, pero también es el título del libro que recién publicaba en ese momento Sean. Y la propuesta que viene que viene a traer es propone una mirada de que la arquitectura producida por por el diseño de la energía, digamos, la energía como material, se presenta en relación a una investigación de ciertas tecnologías biológicas que Sean propone que ofrecerían pronto, en ese instante, la capacidad de sentir y percibir el entorno de una manera nueva. Y hay una propuesta de, digamos, de aumento de la percepción sensorial que le da un nuevo control al material genérico que reemplazaría ciertas nociones de paredes o cáscaras y en sí de la noción de límite, ¿no? De la arquitectura como constructora de límites. Entonces, esa propuesta, como parte del Redux, que siempre estamos construyendo estas relaciones, ¿no? De estas visitas a la escuela y de cómo se entrelazan los sentidos. Se vincula con una conferencia que transmitimos el semestre pasado, que era la conferencia de Akil Moe, que es de 2017, es posterior a la vista de Sean, que se llama Architecture and Energy in the Age of Open Systems, que también de vuelta Akil estaba presentando parcialmente un libro sobre el Empire State Building, y la relación entre ambos es la postulación de intereses con lo invisible, digamos, con aquello que no es dibujable. En el caso de Kiel son los sistemas termodinámicos que interactúan entre ellos, mientras que Sean, ahora os voy a contar un poquito mejor, pero es sobre esa noción de envolvente o de desarticulación de qué es el material, si la energía o otro tipo de materiales más convencionales, pero ambos están revisando nociones que estaban pasando al frente en ese momento y que ahora claramente están al frente, digamos, y que la arquitectura no había renovado todavía. Entonces, me parece muy interesante en ambos casos, y el de hoy todavía es anterior, o sea, es 2013, cómo estas ideas se estaban introduciendo y cómo se estaban introduciendo en lo que ahora ya se ha vuelto totalmente transversal, ¿no? Y por eso también ha ido como abriéndose de maneras muy diversas, pero tiene el origen en este momento. Entonces, la conferencia de Sean en ese sentido nos introduce a varias preguntas, o sea, él genera bastantes preguntas, está claro que está queriendo problematizar una condición, así que es una conferencia donde vemos la postulación de algo que va a venir, de una cosa que está por venirse, y nos muestra proyectos que empiezan a investigar, a generar ciertas intuiciones en ese marco. Lo que introduce muy claramente es esta idea de que los límites físicos están naturalizados de algún modo, y qué pasaría o cómo sería considerar la energía como un material edilicio, ¿no? Rápidamente, entonces, surge la pregunta sobre la representación, porque en general, naturalmente, no se dibuja o no se dibujaba la energía que está alrededor y adentro de los edificios, los microplanetas o la condición como más atómica, digamos, sino que se dibuja con líneas. Entonces, esta propuesta está enmarcada también en una propuesta, digamos, de representación estética de ir de la superficie a la idea de intensidad, ¿no? O sea, los campos de intensidad, hay campos que en realidad tienen como unos límites más difusos y también que tienen menos convenciones, menos disciplinariedad, también diría, atrás de ellos, y empiezan a ser un lugar de inquiry. En ese sentido, este sería como el planteo inicial. Después en la conferencia, John toca temas que claramente es pertinente tocar, ¿no? Como el tema de que la energía, o sea, ¿qué es la energía? La energía es una industria muy grande. La energía, digamos, precisa en la colaboración en la gestión de los edificios de una cierta especialización, o sea, así como las grandes obras se construyen con muchos especialistas, son grandes equipos, se pregunta cuál sería y cómo sería este sujeto que viene a intervenir en el proyecto de arquitectura en este frente, pero también nos contextualiza qué ha pasado con las envolventes. Esto, digamos, sucede en estas resonancias en los propios ciclos del CEAC, en el propio momento en el que estamos, que es el lunes va a ser la presentación del libro, ¿no? Con Alejandro de las políticas de la envolvente, y de hecho Sean en esta charla comenta algunas cosas que Alejandro introduce en el libro, que es cómo cómo la envolvente ha cambiado políticamente en relación justamente a la industria de la energía, ¿no? Como en una primera instancia de las grandes colonizaciones se construyen, por ejemplo, los invernaderos en los cuales se podía transportar ciertas especies de plantas de países tropicales a Inglaterra, ¿no? Y eso genera inteligencias de la envolvente, inteligencias de las burbujas, por ejemplo, ¿no? Y que en lugar de hacer como target el cuerpo, es el ambiente, se replican ambientes. Pero después también están como todas las crisis del petróleo y de la Guerra Mundial, la Segunda Guerra Mundial, y cómo los edificios se sellan, ¿no? Y la condición del airtightness, que lo que hace es encerrar los edificios, volverse muy autosuficientes y no confiar en el aire exterior, que podría llegar a estar contaminado. Obviamente él no lo menciona en esta conferencia, pero esto tiene como background ciertas teorías y un libro muy particular de Sloterdijk que habla sobre el aire como weapon, ¿no? Y está muy vinculado a esos momentos. Entonces, esta progresión, digamos, de poder encapsular ambientes, encerrarse, después volver a abrirse, eso tiene una historia, y es una historia que está vinculada a la tecnología. Entonces Sean la introduce y de algún modo deja abierto en qué sentido nos estaríamos posicionando, se estaría posicionando él en ese momento respecto de esa progresiva politización de la energía. En principio parecería que hacia un lugar más interesado en el confort. Hay un momento que manifiesta como que están buscando esa idea de confort, y en ese sentido parece que están temperando el ambiente, y bueno, de nuevo, ¿no? Un poco una referencialidad no explicitada a Banham y a esas teorías del clima temperado. Y para terminar un poco, o sea, entre su postulación, su conceptualización y contextualización disciplina respecto del problema de la energía, hay básicamente un mensaje en la conferencia. Es un mensaje que es un mensaje de movilización, en el sentido de decir, hay que inspirar desde la arquitectura para definir qué es lo que tiene que venir. O sea, hay que inspirar a los científicos, hay que inspirar a los ingenieros para decir qué tipo de mundo queremos y cómo queremos que la energía como material tome responsabilidad, ¿no? Y esa actitud creo que ahora a lo mejor es sano recuperarla, ¿no? Que es cómo desde la arquitectura se puede inspirar para ir hacia adelante, en lugar de a lo mejor como responder a algo que parecería que ya le ha ganado de mano desde afuera de la disciplina, ¿no? Así que creo que este colapso temporal que sucede en el Redux en estos casos te hace un poco recordar la actitud, y creo que nada, que por lo pronto es muy inspirador volver a planteárselo, y también como volver a revisar cómo se ha inspirado, en qué ha devenido y cuál es la fuerza que puede haber tomado este tipo de aproximaciones hoy, ¿no? Así que nada, ese es un poco el contexto de la charla que vamos a ver hoy.
Buenísimo. Siguiendo directamente con lo que decías último, Pensaba cuando decías de la superficie a la intensidad, eh, que me parece que como discurso y quizás en la presentación también, no estoy seguro, tiende más al pensamiento abstracto que a la articulación tecnológica, digamos. Pero me parece que es interesante el paso del tiempo entre aquella conferencia y todo lo que transcurrió, porque pensaba, por ejemplo, no sé, justo después nombraste el libro de Alejandro Sadar Polo, ¿no? Que básicamente es un libro donde se ve este movimiento, que es el que estoy tratando de llegar a decir, que es como de un pensamiento abstracto a alguna versión material de eso. Por ejemplo, no sé, algo que estuvo investigando David Salomon en su
Sí.
estudio, que es arquitectura hecha de materiales capaces de capturar el CO2, ¿no? O sea,
Ujú.
no, pensaba que es como casi como una función de discursos como, no discursos, sino prácticas o investigaciones como la de John Lally, quizás generalizándolo, pero quizás esa parte en específico, que tienen efectos mucho más pequeños que lo abarcativo de lo que presentan, y mucho más adelante en el tiempo, y sin ningún tipo de quizás reconocimiento, no sé, o no por el reconocimiento, sino por la afiliación, digamos.
Claro, claro. Sí, sí, pero es curioso, no, es curioso, sí, lo de, antes también cuando estaba leyendo eso pensaba en lo de David del semestre pasado, porque es muy reciente, y, y un poco lo que estás introduciendo son como los dos lados de esto, porque uno es el de la representación, eh, que es cómo se dibuja eso, y al dibujarlo, cómo eso transformaría potencialmente una idea de arquitectura, en particular, en realidad, de esta intensificación del aire como material. Y el otro es el de cuáles son las tecnologías, cuáles son los ensamblajes materiales que están sucediendo, ¿no? O sea, cuáles son, eh, digamos, las invenciones de toda la arquitectura, cómo la arquitectura lo vuelve técnica, pero no solo técnica, sino como proyecto, ¿no? Que sería más lo de las políticas del envolvente de Alejandro, o sea, que no es tanto cómo se dibuja, sino cómo se da, cuáles son las conjugaciones entre la economía, la política, la arquitectura, la técnica, los materiales, los costos, el mercado, ¿no? Y eso como la complejidad del clic que eso genera, los saltos de, bueno, el muro cortina tal y cual, ¿no? El mullion afuera, el mullion adentro, el problema de ahora de las passive house y del espesor excesivo, engordado, y de la pérdida de metros cuadrados por el espesor de los muros, ¿no? O sea, él atraviesa, Alejandro, en esa descripción eso. En cambio, el otro lado es el lado de, bueno, ¿y cómo se dibujaría esa energía, ¿no? Entonces me parece interesante que en lo de Sean, que es como bastante anterior, están las dos cosas como preocupaciones y como preguntas, y a lo mejor ahora, no sé, repreguntaría si esa escisión, en qué consiste o cuál es el interés de esa escisión, ¿no? También.
Eh, yo creo que funciona de hecho esa decisión, no es
Claro,
o sea,
sí.
tiene múltiples causas, pero me parece que es más de hecho que de derecho, digamos.
Ujú.
Eh,
Sí.
hay fuerzas que se mueven en esa dirección. eh, y sí, me parece interesante como fenómeno igual, pero... sí, no, me quedé pensando en lo de cómo se dibuja, que también es algo que viene, o sea, o que está en algunos... estaba, por ejemplo, en la presentación de Marco Poleto, ¿no? La preocupación
Claro,
por el dibujo también.
sí, es verdad. Sí. Sí, y en cambio lo de Kill Moe no tanto, ¿no? O sea, que era como, bueno, ¿cuánto pesa? ¿De qué material está hecho? ¿Qué procesos
Claro,
tuvieron esos materiales? ¿No? que es el
Sí,
estilo.
era como más narrativo, descriptivo, cuantitativo.
Claro,
Sí,
sí, sí, sí. La crítica está por otro lado. Pero es cierto, lo de Marco decía específicamente cómo se dibuja y de hecho el workshop que estaba dando era de ese lápiz que dibujaba en el
claro.
espacio, ¿no? O sea, sí, hace 2 semanas solo de lo de Marco, fue lindo. Em, sí, sí.
No, y volviendo a la decisión, no sé si algo es indebido o tanto como que la arquitectura disciplina a eso. O sea, es un acto de disciplinamiento casi,
Ajá,
me parece. Con sus inercias, me parece que disciplina a ese discurso que no puede articular. Hay como una especie de movimiento que
ajá,
lo, lo- lo- lo vuelve parte de sí, digamos, como
claro.
hay una tensión a reinscribirlo, digamos, porque la distancia que hay entre superficies intensivas y querer dibujar la energía
Mm,
y no sé qué ladrillo que captura CO2, pero una unidad discreta y so on, es muy grande, digamos.
mm.
Sí, ¿no?
Sí, sí, sí. No, sí, creo que es interesante el problema. Pensaba, sí, o sea, por ahí no nos vamos a estirar mucho más, pero la cuestión de que, dependiendo qué haces, qué produce, ¿no? Porque eh, ¿dónde inviertes? Que si inviertes en cómo comunicarlo, que igual sería importante, eso mismo toma ciertas formas, ¿no? O sea, ya hay muchas prácticas que sucedieron en esos tiempos, como lo de Philip Ram, ¿no? Pero, como que eran, ¿no? Que son proyectos que construyen condiciones de temperatura, tanto interiores como exteriores. O sea, tiene un parque, creo, no sé si es en Seúl o en algún lugar en China, que genera como estados de humedad y eso está dibujado como unos campos de color y así, ¿no? Entonces, es como si fuera que aquello que dibujan y aquello que se percibe en realidad no se corresponden. Hay una desconexión interesante, porque no es que lo que dibujan es lo que se percibe es una sensación corporal, lo que dibujan es la medición de aquello que genera esa sensación corporal, ¿no? Por decir
Sí,
algo.
a lo sumo el índice, con suerte, digamos.
Exacto.
O una
Pero,
codificación o...
claro, y es altamente técnico eso,
Ujú.
pero nada, se construyen como esas, por mirarlo desde ese lado, creo que también hay algo de que es como, son sistemas de valores distintos, ¿no? Porque es el sistema de valor de cómo se percibe o
Mm.
de la fenomenología, ¿no? Como del fenómeno que tú puedes percibir con tu cuerpo, de la corporeidad que registra eso. En
Mm.
cambio, creo que la otra tendencia no tiene tan presente el cuerpo en el sentido de sus afectos, sino que eh, opera respecto de otro tipo de diálogo disciplinar. Entonces son como culturas disciplinares distintas. Lo que a lo mejor es sorprendente en la charla de Sean es que no hace un énfasis excesivo en la representación, pero sí está más interesado en cómo se recibe, cuál es el registro que uno tiene con su cuerpo de eso, y a lo mejor todas las lógicas más eh, del antropoceno, digamos, que también Chris, ¿no? La conferencia de Chris Hyde, porque ahora todas empiezan a resonar mucho más entre sí
Ujú. Ujú.
de la arquitectura como del antropoceno, también empiezan a relativizar ese registro del cuerpo como unidad de registro y empiezan a ser un poco distintas. Igual John no está haciendo énfasis, ahora me estoy pensando un poco al mismo tiempo, ¿no? John habla de las ciudades generando también desprendiendo cierta energía, está hablando de la energía más en general, entonces también es interesante en ese sentido, pero creo que hay algo de la cuestión del confort o de la cuestión de la energía en sí, de su transformación y de cómo esa transformación es arquitectura. Yo diría que eso es lo interesante de la charla de hoy, como pensar que la energía es arquitectura y cómo se trabajaría dentro de eso, y creo que a lo mejor más que dar muchas respuestas, abre algunos caminos y que uno puede entonces ver cuáles son esas resonancias y cuánta tirada tuvieron, ¿no? O tienen, digamos, a día de hoy. Así que tiene un poco como ese carácter claramente de abrir, si uno se dispone a digamos,
Claro.
dejar de mirar, ¿no? Por esos pensamientos, diría.
Sí. Sí. No, cuando dijiste abrir pensé en a querer disciplinarlo, digamos, no es la única, pero que puede ser que en vez de la indiferencia es una voluntad de estos, si uno lo cita, no sé qué quiere decir, pero como una voluntad de disciplinamiento de esa investigación, casi arquitectónica, ¿no? Como de traerla a la tradición arquitectónica, me parece. No sé.
Dale.
Ok.
No, creo que, o sea, me parece que está bueno lo que dices y por ahí propondría que la veamos porque si no también podemos
Totalmente.
dibujar su contexto, pero me parece que no sé, ahora que nos quedan 3 más y vamos hacia la de Sebastián Courian, que es sobre una transescalaridad material muy fuerte y que hace resonancia con la de Sergio Araya, y lo decía por eso, también por la cosa como más microscópica o del dibujo de lo pequeño, que también está presente aquí, pero de una manera menos matérica y más energética, y creo que esa es otra de las, digamos, de los splits entre lo matérico y lo energético, que son discursos distintos. Nada, como que creo que se nos viene, no sé, como especie de escalamiento de relaciones, como que las discusiones que tenemos post son cada vez más relativas, y que esto que dices de la disciplinar, creo que también podemos seguirlo a medida que hacemos relaciones en las 3 próximas de este ciclo, ¿no? Así que nada,
Buenísimo.
no, está bueno.
Lo vemos. La vemos
Dale.
a la transmisión.
Vale, gracias, Manuel. Nos vemos la
Chao.
próxima.
Gracias, Ana. Hasta luego.
Before we even get going, I just want to say thanks both to the university for having me down here, but even more specifically to Nicole Michelle, because of all you did a great host here, so thank you very much. So what I want to talk about today is this is a project that I've recently done. It's a book called Air from the Planets. It is more or less I don't want to say it's manifesto, but it's the idea that I'm trying to put forward, an idea which kind of links the last 10 years of design projects and an interest always in writing. So for maybe as a discussion maybe more with the students here too, is that as an architect, much of my work is as much about writing as it is about trying to build. And this has always been kind of back and forth for me. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that by both writing and designing, I'm actually able to work on the same problem, but in different ways. It's like just different mediums, working in clay versus working in marble. And by being able to do both the same, it kind of allows me to get a better grasp of what I'm interested in. So I didn't go forward writing this book because I knew everything I wanted to do. I just wanted to put it into writing. The idea was that there was a kind of objective. And then by researching, I kind of learned more about the bigger idea. And the kind of bigger idea that I'm talking about is this idea of physical boundaries. So in the most mundane way, I think everyone can describe what architecture is to them in different ways and what architecture means. But for me, really, at the end of the day, architecture is really about how we define physical boundaries and how we make those boundaries. Because those boundaries, depending on what material we use, what techniques we use for representing them, do two things. They will do many things, but the main thing that we associate them with is that they organize space, right? So we decide that by creating a physical boundary, you know, that we have a dimension of how big that is. It's probably a living room, maybe a den, kitchen, entry, bathroom. And those boundaries organize both the physical spaces, but they also organize social agendas. They have aesthetics to them. They have shape and form. So everything about that boundary, in the most simple way, how you draw a wall, how you draw any type of edge, is loaded with so many other things. And so this is an artist who has a piece here where obviously this is probably a domestic house. It has boundaries, but it doesn't have walls that we associate with architecture. So you can look at it in terms of dimension and say this is a private house, but in terms of the boundaries that are necessary for this individual to be able to use this as a bedroom, obviously it's a completely different project. So those boundaries become rather important. And what interests me most about all this is looking at this is that the conversation of the air front of the planet is really a question of using energy as a building material. So raising the question of how can we start thinking of energy and the discussion of energy, a discussion that essentially, if you want to think of the biggest economy, market, investment that's going on in the world right now, it's a discussion of energy. So as architects realize that energy is a $17 trillion a year world economy, you realize that it's not something that's just an economy that architects are part of, but it's also a resource that we have to be aware of, things we're dealing with, how we define our spaces, the environment it's a part of. It's a huge, much larger conversation. But what I'm going to try to get to is using the idea of energy and talking about energy not just as something that conditions the interior of a building, or is the light or energy that bounces off the outside of the wall, but actually becomes a building material. The same way that we think about concrete, glass, steel, what have you. These are moments in which we've come up with new materiality, and we've had new spatial dimensions because of that. Social revolutions, architectural new shapes and aesthetics. But to kind of get this as an idea that when we do think about, this is just called where program boxes go to die, is we can't sort of underestimate how much we talk about, when we think about architecture, we think about geometries and surfaces. So whether you're in first year sketching, doing everything by pencil and pen, whether you're in your last year education or a professional working in Rhino, Maya, building a foam model, working in chipboard, everything you do is really an abstraction of a surface. And that surface creates a shape, right? But we don't ever think about the energies around us. We don't think about microclimates. We don't draw in gradients. We always draw with lines. And to give you an idea, these are two different examples. One I'm calling the stacked up, and one I'm calling the stuffed pig. So the stacked up, these are A, B, C, and D. These would be like program boxes. So whether you're working on a program, you're doing a theater, someone says you need an entrance theater, you need a lobby, bathrooms. These all become programs that, in one sense, just become little boxes of program, right? And then you stack those programs together, and you create a shape that comes from all the ideas of these little things that come together. So if you want to make an analogy, this is probably, the stacked up is a lot like looking at an East Dutch office now that's working in the Arcade Eagle, Julian de Schmidt, even some work at OMA around Koolhaas. This idea of basically working in program boxes that then give you an idea of something as a singular thing that gets stacked to make a bigger shape. The flip side of that is the stuff big. Again, surfaces, where if you want to start thinking an analogy in architecture, offices that are someone like Greg Lynn or Zaha Hadid or UN Studio, people who basically are working with a bigger surface, they come up with an idea for the shape of the building, and then like a cut and eat, they chop it into pieces and say that's going to be my entrance, that's going to be my theater, that could be my core, my courtyard, my mechanical system. But really the driving force is the shape itself first, and then you cut it up. The other one is you come up with a lot of smaller components, and then together it comes together as one large thing. The reason I'm showing this though is because if someone basically said, Bjarke Ingels, OMA on one hand, and Greg Lynn, Zaha Hadid on the other, you would immediately start thinking these are polar differences, right? These are very different people working in architecture, right? But in truth, I'm basically saying that they're very similar actually, because they're both working with surfaces as their main mechanism for organizing space. And you can't really underestimate just how ingrained that is in everything we do. So to give you another moment here, this is pink line is basically what I'm saying is architecture today. Architecture is a form of mediation. So this is something that Rainer Banham talks about, if you're familiar with him as a writer, an English writer. And basically, again, this idea of that line, so whether it's the stuffed pig or the stacked duck, there's a geometry, so looking at this wall here, there's a geometry, a line that you draw abstractly, which basically just has all the conversation with the environment around it. It's an act of mediation. So whether it's, you want to call it postmodernism, modernism, Gothic, neo, whatever, it basically does 2 or 3 things. It either allows energy to pass through, like a brise-soleil, well, not a brise-soleil for the lake, but like a porch, or it allows things to bounce back. So it removes that stuff like rain to actually not come in, or like an adobe structure or a parking garage that allows that heat and concrete to say, essentially become internalized, meaning the energy gets absorbed by the piece. But everything in that line, that geometry, is doing all that work, and this becomes the space inside, and that's the space outside. So what I'm interested in trying to think about is, when we talk about energy, we're at a really unique point in time here, because energy is such a large industry, but it's also the thing that we take the most conservatively. Meaning we generally think about creating a box, and then we find a way to cool it or heat it, but we don't really think about what we're doing with the energy beyond that. So the idea of architecture as an amplification is actually saying, what if we think of energy not as the thing that fills the inside of the box already, so you make a building. That's it. You've already decided the organizational structure of this building. You know where you're going to come in, you know where you're going to leave, you know where the light's going to come in, and then you use energy as a way of just filling it up, so we can accommodate it in terms of ideal temperatures. So instead, if you think of amplification, what if we actually take those energies and use them to actually build space itself, like microclimates? And I'll talk more about this, but it's essentially saying, what if architecture, we actually give shape to energy, and that becomes buildings. That becomes architecture, and the architecture isn't just the thing that's perfect, where we put all our aesthetics, we put all our value, we put all our money, we put all our design into that pink line. But instead, what if we start putting our money and efforts into the energies themselves? So, again, this is another piece. This is these first 2 diagrams you can kind of pull back by the model evidence, but these are, through history, when you think about geometry, you realize that these are tied to not just the spaces they create, but the way in which we organize space. So whether it's the Palladian villa, which is a netless circulation, meaning you have these discrete rooms, and to get to each room you have to pass through the other room. Or the idea of the corridor, which comes about in the 18th century. So we like to think that the corridor has been around with us forever, but in truth it's not more than 300 years old. And the idea with the corridor is each of those rooms become hermetic, different shapes. And you can take an elevator or a stair, move through it, and not actually intervene with any of these spaces. But whether you're going from a Palladian villa to a corridor to most buildings and projects today, you're using those surfaces to create that space. And it's basically a line, and that's that thin line, whether it's glass, steel, concrete, that you can abstract as a thin line. Obviously, when you go into construction documents and such, those thin lines get a little bigger, but nonetheless, they're dimensional lines. If we start thinking about energy, though, the big shift here is why what I'm interested about it is that it's a fundamental shift in how we define space. It's a gradient. Energy can't be represented as a line. You can't draw a line and say, that's energy. Because energy always moves in particles and waves. It has intensities, it has fallouts. So the idea is if you're looking at these red pieces, when you have something that's netless circulation where you're moving from one spot to the next, going through other people's business to get to where you want to go, when you have a corridor, what happens when we start thinking about intensities and fallouts? What happens when we start thinking about energy as our, not only just as a material, but actually as an organizational structure? That becomes actually new ways to actually organize the space. So Bannon has another example where he talks about the tent versus the cave. Sorry, the campfire. Right? You have a cave, it has a defined interior, you're in it or you're out of it, it has a dimension, you can put your hands across to it. But a fire has an equal amount of organizational structure. Right? You have an intensity, you can be around it, you can be in the dark, you can be more close to the heat, the light. So it has an organizational structure, it's just not the one we recognize with the cave. And so the idea is, moving out of this idea of the surfaces into the idea of the intensities. And so, this is a brightish screen. Is this idea of how do we now move forward with energy and actually make it a generator for the architect? Because any advancement that's going to happen in energy, whether it's battery storage, collecting more energy from the sun, geothermal, the next kind of gadget that's going to allow us to harness more energy, is not going to come from an architect, most likely. That's not what we do. We don't have the science behind it. We know how to, what we do really well is actually, when it comes to like iron, glass, these are moments in which other industries were really instrumental in actually creating that material. What architects did really well shows what we can do with it. The sort of imagination of being able to push the boundaries of those materials to create new possibilities. So when it comes to energy, what we really need to be thinking, this is a conference that for me was really intriguing, was called, well, the article is called Inspiration Theory. It was written by Neil Stevenson. And what it's about is essentially he goes to a conference, it's in Arizona State, and he's talking to this large conference that they put together, which they're actually trying to figure out how to create more innovation and how to kind of be leaders at the sort of university level. They're bringing in scientists, engineers. He's a science fiction writer. He wrote The Baroque Cycles or Snow Crash. And he goes in and gives this talk, and he's talking to a bunch of scientists and engineers. And he's saying that he's really lamenting the big changes. That when he grew up as a kid, there was talk about going to the moon, there was talk about going into space. And the same year that he's doing all this, this is the year in which the space shuttle of the United States gets decommissioned. And NASA basically decides they're not going to go into manned flight anymore. So it's this kind of depressing moment where we're kind of restricting back. And he's saying that there really haven't been any advancements in the sciences and engineering that had happened in the years prior to that. And he just basically feels as if he's not seeing those advancements ahead of time as much as he thought he was going to. And one of the examples that he's giving is that within engineering and sciences, the thing about that which makes them so unique now is if you're going to go into biochemistry or you're going to go into some form of engineering, you're probably going to spend a large portion of your career working on one very small thing. Because in order to work on a cancer solution or work on a new technology, they're so complex, there's so many people working on it, and you're going to find yourself working on a very small trajectory to be part of a bigger conversation. And so the question is, where are the kind of bigger visions that are going to allow people to move forward? To his surprise, though, Michael Crow, who is the president of Arizona State, kind of got up and said, you know what, in terms of where we're going today, it's not the scientists and engineers that have failed, it's actually you, the science fiction writer. You as science fiction writers aren't giving us visions out there of the future that are going to inspire a new generation of engineers and scientists to want to go into it. So the Jules Verne's, the people out there who are creating and coming up with new world possibilities. And then really all you're doing right now is coming up with utopic or dystopic worlds. Either the world burns and all goes to hell because of a nuclear disaster, or everyone lives happily ever after on another planet. And he's saying what we really need is for the science fiction writers, the people who are writing this stuff, to actually give plausible possibilities that will inspire a generation to move forward. And that was really kind of intriguing to me because when we go back to a discussion of energy, right now everything in the discussion of energy primarily goes back to a specialization. So it's a lot like the conversation of scientists and engineers. If you look in the 15th century, the idea of the architect, Brunelleschi, working on the Duomo. He's the engineer, he's the architect, he's working on the contraptions that build the project. The definition of what an architect is rather wide open. It's not until the 18th century that the engineer and the architect split. And they become two different things. This has a lot to do with the advent of iron, the coating of iron that gives you more strength. The engineers are trying to figure out what to do with engineering building and structural capabilities. And there becomes a kind of schism both within the Beaux-Arts and how you're educated, but also in how you practice. But that's 18th century. If you look on the left-hand side, when you look at any building, you go to your favorite architect's website, you look for a giant project that they did, and then look at the credits and see how many people were required, how many specializations are needed to make a project viable. Projects are so complex, there's so many people involved, that you need a large group of people who have specialties to do that. But in terms of governing bodies, if you look at the architect, it's in 1857 that the American Institute of Architects is formed. It's really not until 50 years later that they become a governing body, which means you have to get a stamp to say I'm an architect. Landscape architects, 1899. Planners, 1978. So before 1978 in the United States, you didn't have to be a licensed planner to do the work. Structural engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, civil engineering, acoustic engineering. These are licensed bodies. And I think it's like if you look at even interior design now in the United States, there's at least 3 or 4 states that require you to be a licensed interior designer to practice. The other 47 don't require it. But even beyond the license, you have you know, if you're going to be doing a large project, you need a photovoltaic plant design, wind studies, team building, someone who does nothing but build proper teams so that a project can move forward on a schedule. Security consultant, lighting design, fire protection, traffic, theater. And when you think about energy, this is where I'm kind of talking about with the lecture here is, clearly when you get down to energy, it's another subset. I mean, it's another subset. It's another thing where it's becoming a specialization. It's the thing you learn more and more about so that you can make a building energy neutral, passive, you know, get the LEED certification. And just like all of these, it's extremely important, and it's in no way a comment that is not the direction that needs to be happening. But for me, when you're thinking about, what's interesting about this with the discussion of energy, is energy basically as a form of energy exists in nearly all of these, whether you're talking about landscape architect, whether you're talking about architect, whether you're talking about lighting design, acoustic consultants, civil engineers, the landscape, the use of energy becomes an integral part in all of this. So where does energy fall? Is energy going to go in the direction of being the thing that's a more specialized direction? Or like the inspiration theory that Bill Stevens is talking about, is that an opportunity for the architect to take a step back and say energy instead can be a vehicle to talk about new possibilities? And if you do that, maybe you can then inspire the next generation of engineers and scientists who are going to help solve some of these issues about sustainability, harnessing more energy, storing energy, so on and so forth. Like how can, if we give them a vision of what the world can be or how architecture can look, someone else can help us then get to that end goal. But we can't do it all on our own. So for me, the idea is how can we start thinking of energy as a material? And if you start thinking of it as a material, then you start giving it responsibility. You start giving it organizational responsibility. You start giving it spatial responsibility. You start giving it, basically it becomes an architectural block. It actually becomes a physical boundary that organizes space. And we know that when we come up with things like plate glass, where we start having this transparency of inside and outside. So Richard Neutra, this idea of the pool that literally comes inside the building. Steel, large spans, cantilevers. The kind of malleability of concrete that you can create these shapes, reinforced concrete. So the example, you know, a good example would be thinking about the advent of iron, the advent of glass, in which you start getting this new possibility, say in France and England, with the great exhibition halls. You have countries that are colonizing the world and bringing an industrial revolution of products, and then you have states who have a nationalistic pride in which they want to start showing all this stuff off. At first, people didn't know what to do with steel, what to do with iron. They just reproduced the things we already know. They made buildings that looked like other buildings, except they were done with smaller columns. But eventually, people started realizing that there's an opportunity to create new things, and create new typologies and new forms, and then, of course, then new architecture. And when we look at it, we realized that that this discussion of energy is long going. It coincides a lot of times with other advents that are happening at the same time. So if you look around the mid-17th century, with Carlo Fontana from Borromini in Rome, this idea of this kind of plastic, continually voluptuous shapes and forms, almost, you know, not quite liquid, not quite solid, just sort of very voluptuous conditions. But around the same exact time, John Baptiste is actually using the word gas for the first time. So the word gas comes into existence to describe something that's not solid and not liquid. Or the idea of the ecstasy of St. Teresa of Bernini, where you're looking at church as a hidden light source that's bringing light down, and they're sculpting all this stone and marble to look like a cloud and completely weightless. So it looks like this kind of cloud of stone that you know is essentially just floating in space. So this is the same time, more or less, in which atmosphere is determined to have weight. So Pierre Petit confirms the theory that atmosphere has weight by carrying a barometer to the top of the mountain to show that atmospheric pressure decreases with height. Or we're just talking about the greenhouses. So at the same time with the palm house, within 100 years time span, you have people who are bringing back exotic plants from around the world and trying to figure out how to display them and show them and use them around, and show basically their power. In fact, they collected them from all over the world, and these are their specimens from around the world. But if you want to collect something from the Caribbean and bring it back to London, it's going to die unless you create the environment that's necessary to grow it. So between steel and glass, you start to create these giant greenhouses. But it's really, you know, within 50 to 60 years prior to that, prior to this cast iron and iron, Carl Scheele is basically synthesizing oxygen for the first time. So someone's actually taking the chemical compositions that exist in here that you're trying to make more humid and actually making them artificially in the lab. And then just kind of moving forward, this is a kind of conversation in which Peter Sloterdijk talks a little bit about in his Bubbles book. But he's discussing the fact that, and of course, when you do talk about kind of extreme advancements, they tend to link back to the military one way or the other. But this is a point in time in 1915 where gas warfare really picks up. And he points out that this is a really intriguing moment because this is the first time in which you're going to war and you're not actually shooting an arrow or a spear or a bullet to kind of kill somebody as a missile. Like you're not trying to kill the body, but actually poisoning the entire environment so it kills anybody that goes in it. So instead of targeting the body, you're targeting the environment. And anything that's in that environment dies. So this is done with chlorine gas. And of course, the interesting thing about this, even though it's as destructive as this thing was, that when you look at chlorine gas and you look at the way they were doing this, is that it has a shape to it. It had an interiority to it. Meaning that you could be on the outside of this, as this guy is here, or over here, and be outside that environment of chlorine gas. If you're on the perimeter of the gas, you probably will get sick and not die. If you're on the interior of it and exposed to it a longer period of time, you die. And so it has this kind of conditionings around it. But at the same time, we're talking about these various shapes. We're talking about the mediation of the environment as this surface. What really happens around the same time, this is one of the things that really intrigues me about all this, is that when you're talking about these different possibilities, you realize that the idea of the environment, how we kind of qualities of those energies, versus that of the geometries that are trying to actually reproduce it are somewhat similar in time. So in 1950, you have chlorine gas being deployed. You also have, roughly 30 years prior to that, the advent essentially of air conditioning that we know today. So you're talking about actually dehumidifying something and taking moisture out of the air so people can produce and mass produce factories. To do that, though, of course, they sealed the building, right? So if you can find a way to lower the humidity level in here, or increase the humidity level so you can produce cotton or do whatever, chocolate, whatever you want to do, you're probably going to find a way to make sure that that air from the outside doesn't come in and contaminate it. So they wind up sealing the room like a bubble and creating this interior space. So what winds up happening, and the kind of juncture here for me, is that architecture really went the way at this point of the gas mask as opposed to the gas. Meaning, from this point forward, envelopes become more and more complex to control and mediate, and less interest is being given to the idea that you can actually manipulate the environment as an occupiable space. I mean, you can't argue with it. I mean, one killed millions of people and one saved millions of people. But it's kind of an intriguing moment where the gas mask is no really different in the sense than the architectural building bulb. Right? You can make it as thin as you want. You can make it all transparent. You can literally make it a bubble, but it's still an architectural surface. It still keeps one thing out and one thing in if they don't mix. And so ironically, one of the examples to look at this that actually talks about where we can go with this is the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And if you look back to the Olympics, the first thing you probably think about are giant surfaces, big buildings. You have images of the bird's nest, the water cube. They're basically, everything that tells you about that existence was basically giant building images. But we also know that within Beijing and within all Olympics and all sports, that the environment you move in is critical. It plays a big role in how you perform and how the sports are performed. So building up to the Olympics, they actually had a moratorium that actually cut off vehicles moving through the city for a week so that they could actually get down to smog level, so that it could be habitable for people moving through there, doing the marathon, doing exercise they have outside for the sports. So they're actually trying to get that smog out of the city for a period of time. And this, of course, even if it's a pristine environment, wherever you are in the United States, in the world, what have you, the idea is that you basically, if you're a runner, if you're training, you probably train at a higher altitude because there's less oxygen out there. The idea being that when you come down to sea level, to a city that most likely is near a sea level condition, there's more oxygen and you can perform better. So you can always manipulate the environment, or at least in your body to a certain degree, so you can perform. But the kind of great moment happened, and this is the kind of commentary that was going on. This is the Aquatic Center. And it's sort of understood this is where Michael Phelps won the 12 gold medals and broke all the records. I think it was something like in this Olympics, something along the lines of 45 world records were broken, and in one race, the first 4 people to finish had all gone under the world record. So, I mean, it's just astronomically crazy. And a couple of reasons were the suits that they were wearing, which are now illegal, so you can't wear the suits that they were wearing because they were found that they were actually being extra buoyant and causing manipulation between one country and another country that didn't have access to them. But the other thing that was going on is the discussion that this is the fastest pool that they had created. When they talk about the fastest pool, they're not talking about this stuff so much, as they're talking about everything that's in the pool itself. The dimensions of the pool, how deep the pool is, the gutters where the water dissipates, everything they can, the water, the kind of wave meters that run through the pool, everything that basically allows that when your body hits that water, it doesn't get in the way of the person next to you. So that you get the fastest times, fastest completions, everyone's happy, world records are broken, sponsors are happy, all good. But they were basically saying that at this point in time, they thought they had more or less reached the kind of epicenter, or the kind of peak of possible speeds. And they weren't going to get any faster through the geometry. But we did point out, this is a former Olympic swimmer who was a broadcaster, was saying if the pools are going to get faster, if things are going to continually move, and that's what we want, everyone wants an even playing field, that the advent, the kind of, the discoveries weren't going to come in the geometry, they were actually going to come from the water itself. So actually engineering the water, moving the actual thing that you move through, changing the chemical composition of that. Because at that point, it's open to everybody, regardless of whether you have a suit or you have a special suit, whatever, or where you train. The environment is equal playing field. So they're actually talking about changing the chemical composition of the water, salinity, so on and so forth, so that they can actually have a faster pool. And it actually would become, the thing about this, which is really intriguing, is that this becomes a point in time where you're not talking about changing the house that you work in, you're not talking about tempering the environment so that it's ideal or comfortable or 72 degrees and X amount of relative humidity. It's not about comfort control. It's actually changing the chemical composition of the thing you move through for a performance base. So it's actually like engineering the air, engineering the water. And this is a beautiful project by Peter Liversidge in 2009. But what I'm trying to get to is that I'm not talking about duplicating preconceived notions of climate. So the idea is to actually reproduce the temperature or the climate in one zone into another. This is what we already do when we talk about the interior spaces. We generally have a preconceived notion of what 72 degrees, 50% relative humidity, and that's the ideal condition. So I'm not actually saying we need to reproduce things we know. The idea, and hence the title of the lecture, The Air from Other Planets, is the idea that this is a materiality where we can potentially start thinking about environments that we don't immediately recognize. It doesn't mean that they can't be responsible, but it just means we don't need to put our energy into producing things that we have already recognized. So when we're looking at this, these are our atmospheric variables. We have electromagnetic, we have thermodynamics, we have sound waves, we have chemical compositions. These all exist in the environment. What I'm talking about, much like the pool, is to take those environments and basically intensify them or amplify them to make them into something else. Much like you would have an acoustic guitar that's then plugged into an amplification that then makes it a different sound. It's the same chords, but it has a different resonance to it because of the amplification technique. And that's more or less where architecture starts to move forward. So it's not a reinvention of the environment, it's actually just the manipulation and amplification of things we know to create something else. So one example of this would be, this is a project we did, a proposal in Estonia, and it was for a large, it's in Peru, so there's a lake to the backside. This is the existing town here, and they have this in-between space that they want to turn into a commercial, residential, hotel, and recreational fields for the town, for the city, and for the attractions. But of course, a lot of this is for particular times of the year. And so what we were doing, we were kind of looking through the project, we were cutting this plan, a black and white drawing. And we realized that we were essentially creating a type of Noli plan, where a Noli plan, essentially, if you look at, this is a 18th century map that was done with all of Rome. It's one of the first times they actually mapped the entire thing, street by street. And it's a black and white map, but it's public versus private. So everything that's white is public. Everything that's black is private. The beauty of that is if you start to get stuff like the Pantheon here, you don't actually have a black object, you have a white object, because it's actually a public church. So you actually walk into that. It's basically saying that Piazza Navona and the Pantheon are basically the same space, they're public open spaces. And what we were looking at instead is, what if we start thinking about the gradient only? Because when we cut that plan through the city, we started realizing we had a black and white map, but it wasn't public versus private. It was interior conditioned spaces and outside natural environment. And it was somehow this kind of black and white, one versus the other, the fact that the two don't actually mix up. But if you redraw the Noli plan or part of Rome here, and you don't do it versus public versus private, but you do it versus conditioned and unconditioned, you start to get a gradient condition of those in-between spaces, places where sun gets and shade goes, where buildings dump energy, where infrastructure is putting energy back into the land. So whether we're aware of it or not, whether we do it consciously or not, we're always using energy as a way of manipulating the environment that we're in. We just do it as byproducts. Architects generally don't start thinking ahead of time in the sense that, how can we use energy, if we are going to manipulate the environment, can we do it as an architectural aesthetic and an actual particular move? So whether your building is casting a shadow, causing a reflection, infrastructure is dumping energy out, urban heat islands. So cities get so big and have so much asphalt and pavings that they actually change the temperature on the inside of the city to the outside of the city. Or energy dumps, buildings that simply have to expel the body heat that we're producing in this room right now, the computers. That energy then has to get expelled and get dumped into the environment. And so if you add those things together, you start to realize that there's not really a black and white indication of the city. I mean, as much as we like to think we draw that line of black and white being conditioned and unconditioned, there's actually a kind of gradient in between. So we started looking at how we can actually take, these are a series of activities from December to January, kind of outlining what time of year they happen, when they can happen, how far they go, do they have to be cut off. And starting to think, can we actually increase some of them, maybe just by a couple of weeks, maybe by a month, and actually allow those activities to go for a longer period of time. And if you can, that can then stimulate the growth of the town, of the recreational systems that they have, of the community, and so on and so forth. So what we wanted to do is actually just a simple move of taking the building and lifting it off the ground. So most of the programming you understand in terms of the hotel rooms or the programs that we did want to kind of manipulate in terms of the plan, and then put a large greenhouse structure on top of it. The idea being that a series of activities could happen in between, but any of that excess energy can then be pumped down into the interior cores of the building and moved out into the environment. So then you start to get these energy dumps that are not byproducts, but actually controlled and used, and then kind of dumped into the landscape. So when you look at the plan of the building, this is what I'm talking about, the site, the idea of basically cutting it. So these are interiors of buildings, these are exteriors of buildings. This is somewhere you can be in the wintertime or in the summertime. This is where you don't want to be in the wintertime. And so what we're looking to do is, each of these red squares is basically a cutout from the interior of one of those buildings. It goes from the pyramid down into the landscape. And in the summertime, you can probably work to change that environmental quality, the heating, the lighting, however you want to use that energy down to that landscape. It's probably more extreme, but as you get to the fall and you get to the winter, the pressure of the climate actually is going to push on it and it's going to dissipate, obviously. So the idea, one of the characteristics we're going to get to about using energy as a building material is that it has to have a relationship with the context. If the idea of that line and that surface as a mediation is always about pushing back, that line never changes, right? That unless 50 years, 100 years go by and no one touches this building, it's not going to go anywhere. But the idea of energy as an actual material, much like a campfire, it's actually going to increase and decrease depending on the external environment, what it's doing, what's pushing on it. But that's enough, though, to create some connections and increase activity within the proposal and within the city. So these are what I'm talking about, these ones here. In the winter, we're not talking about using that energy to control all the entire environment. We're talking about small moments around the building itself that can connect these together and use activities and conditions. So what are these materials? As I mentioned already, when we think about energy, history of energy is kind of falls into two sides. On one side, you have what Jeff Kipnis talks about as the cosmetic, an article he wrote about Herzog and Denron's work, trying to figure out another word to describe ornament, which he wasn't happy with in terms of how it was portrayed. But the idea is that this idea of the cosmetic you described is essentially kind of atmosphere, mood, a quality, a kind of undescribable effect. You know, it becomes the kind of qualities that allow, the thing that's doing the real work here is the steel and this kind of plastic that mediates the environment and allows these activities to happen on the inside. The effects, the qualities, the lights, the kind of effects that you're talking about, these are just kind of byproducts. They're not doing anything architectural. They're not creating a boundary. They're not spatial. So whether you're talking about that campfire inside a cave that's bouncing light around, or the reflections of water, or anything that's sort of theatrical, those kind of moods and effects, they're not physical boundaries in the sense that they're architectural. They're more kind of byproduct conditions. And on the flip side, comfort control is the exact opposite of that. So we're talking about, again, when Carrier and his partners and others around the turn of the 19th century were figuring out ways in which they could actually dehumidify the environment, find ways of cooling it or heating it. You know, they were trying to find ways in which they could create a sweet zone, which we still use today as a chart, basically that this is what we determine in terms of relative humidity, in terms of temperature, as the sweet spot that we determine as comfort. And that comfort is what we shoot for. So on one side you have a hyper-engineered side, on the other side you have a super qualitative, ephemeral, byproduct, and gestural desire. And so the idea is to figure out, you know, and even more and more so, since the 1970s was the kind of world energy crisis, work from various countries who are going into space and trying to understand how the human body works and how the environments that they live in, we found ways of actually simulating energy like we've never done before. We know more about it, we know how it works. But more or less we use it as architects to produce an ideal condition as cheaply as we can. So energy essentially is seen as a fuel. It's the thing that actually allows this room that's defined architecturally by these walls to then function as efficiently as possible. But if you split this, the example I can probably come up with, which is the closest to what I'm talking about as energy as an actual building material, would be that of street lighting. So a light, you know, is basically just a form of energy, full spectrum light that shoots into a darkness and gives you the ability for your body to see difference and recognize space. So there's a long history about how that light kind of came about, how that light went from being the interior of people's houses to being stuck on the outside, to government agencies telling people that those needed to be strung along strung along strings and actually become city infrastructure. But that light, as everything that we talked about at the very beginning, has a physical boundary. If you're in that boundary, you're on the inside, you actually have security. You're safe, you have security. When you're outside of that light, that goes away. That light, you know, whether it's separate objects going from, you know, this typology of a kind of necklace of light, no light, no light. And that light then therefore has given cities commercial success, it's given recreational possibilities. It allows these activities to happen, but it's an architectural space that I would argue. And that's a form of energy, it's a small bandwidth of energy, but nonetheless it has a shape to it, it has a physical boundary to it, it has a characteristic to it, and it has value to it. It has aesthetic value, and it has monetary value. And so if you add those things up, that's the definition for me of what qualifies as an architectural space. The question is, how can we start adding or using other energies to actually build upon that to create a space? And what would those organizational things play out? So whether you're looking at an individual light, or whether you're looking at a series of those lights strung together that are either duplicating what we know in terms of cities, or illuminating entirely new zones. Lighting has actually become the thing that actually gives cities shape. So those energies, we're looking at those effects, those auras, those qualities, the things that do the least in terms of spatial boundaries. Comfort control, which is the most engineered, but really just producing an ideal condition. When you think about material energies, whether it's acoustic, electromagnetic, chemical, thermodynamic, they really fall into three types. So you have the trophic, the informational, the physical, and without really going into these, the idea is that information is just how you define how the body comes in contact with things. So the physical boundary is quite literally that, right? I can't pass through it, so I'm here. Informational is a lot like something in which it gives you directions. You can choose to ignore it or take it in. So if we're comparing these to energy, informational would be a lot like a street light. Meaning you can see it from a distance, you know it gives security, you know it's a space. but you can walk through it. You can avoid it. Your body doesn't actually come in physical contact with it in the sense that it prevents your movement. Physical would be a lot like the gravity that's holding us down. The use of sound, for instance, now today, which actually sound can be focused much like a laser and actually allow you to actually occupy physical space. So one example would be a lot of furniture stores like Steelcase or Herman Miller. Actually, the first time I think I saw it used was that they really used it. It's something that's developed in the military, but it was in the National Democratic Convention in the United States as well as the Republican, where they basically had president's speeches up, and you could look at a president and then stand in the little zone, and you could hear that speech. And you could come over 2 feet more and hear a different speech. And they use it now in interiors for offices where they could have 10 different TVs or presentations up and running. And depending on how they focus that beam, 3 of you could be listening to one presentation, and 5 of you over there are listening to another presentation, and the 2 don't mix. That's because that beam is focused with a boundary that allows you to occupy a space, while a different group occupies a completely different space. And the last one, trophic, which is just basically the idea that it just it affects the kind of physiology of the human body. So, like blue light, people who have seasonal distress disorder, people who live in places where there's not a lot of light, meaning they don't get vitamin D. Blue light, full spectrum light, can be used as a way of getting that vitamin D into the eyes and helping depression. So really, what I'm trying to get at here is that this is a kind of a good analogy for me. This is a Julia Schulman photograph from one of the case study houses that were such beautiful photographs, not just of the project, but really about the social conditions. People having a dinner party, how they kind of congregate. And the question is, if we scrape out all the geometry, the idea is, what if we start thinking about energy as a physical material? What are the shapes that we give it? What are the kind of variables how does it look? How does it organize space? But more importantly, how does it change the organization of the people that are using it? So it's not just this idea of trading one material for another. I'm not saying let's get rid of concrete and steel and let's just go to energy. They're going to do the same thing. The idea is that they're actually going to have some organizational impact. And so this is one project. This is a project that originally started down in Houston and then moved up into Chicago when I left. But it's an idea of working with this kind of furniture system in which each of these is a piece of vacuum-formed PETG plastic, so a lot like a water bottle. It is a water bottle plastic. And the idea is that these become little congregations in which each one of these has a sealed cavity and with a heating filament inside it. And it gives off heat, so it traps the heat in a kind of enclosed environment. And the idea being is that we can either use that as pulling from an energy source to warm that heating filament, or potentially using renewable sources that come from parking garage or the infrastructure of the city that's dumping it that we can then harness. But the idea is that each one of these maybe doesn't do a whole lot individually, but as you start grouping them together, you actually start to create physical boundaries. So these are maybe warm to the touch as you sit upon them, but they actually change the microclimate around them. So you start to see that people, the kind of environment around it actually physically starts to change. The snow is melting, grass can be growing. The people who are here on the outside, sort of black silhouette, their bodies haven't kind of come in contact with it yet. And the ones who are people who are in red are people who are actually involved, and they're actually starting to feel the changes of the environment around them. And so it was kind of similar in the sense that we were looking at the Tumula project in Estonia, trying to figure out what are the activities of markets to outdoor theaters to sports. This is something we're looking at Chicago because Chicago does get so cold. But in the summer months, Chicago's park systems are packed. Every day, every minute, something is organized. Because people are trying to get as much activity as they can from the beautiful weather before things start shutting down right about now for the next 7 months. So we were trying to figure out what if we could actually extend some of these activities just a little bit longer so that we could actually have people involved with them and moving through them. And so these are the shapes. They're just milled, large milled pieces that then were vacuum formed and pulled, and then prototyping started to be tested. Again, in terms of like the planning here, you have one row piece on the side that may be just tactile to the human body, but as they actually start to conglomerate together, you start to create bigger zones. They just essentially nest into each other. So you have systems of just light, colored you with the water actually, with the heating water vapor, and the ceilings themselves. The other one I want to talk about quickly is this idea of a kind of artificial carpet or turf, which is ironically, unfortunately, timely only because this is something that was kind of inspired by the Astrodome, which is in Houston, Texas. So when I was there for a while, I was very familiar with it. And when you think about having a nice day outside, you think about grass that's cut, you need the sun, you need no rain, you need the actual environment around you to be ideal so that you can go out and use it. And if you have another idea, would be the idea of a kind of carpet, right? So you have a hardwood floor, any kind of floor, you can then get a carpet system, throw it down, and your body has a kind of tactile element to it. In terms of the environment, one of the kind of great stories is this idea of AstroTurf, which was created essentially in Houston, Texas for the Astrodome. So the Astrodome, kind of tongue-in-cheek called the eighth wonder of the world, is a large dome structure that's enclosed that had glass all on the inside, and then had a playing field with grass below. The idea being that the sun could come out, you could control it, you could grow the grass on the inside, everyone would be happy, football could happen if you do what they need to do. What they found that happening very quickly at Amsterdam was that there was such a large sectional change from bottom to top that the heat on the top and the cool air in the bottom actually created a convection cycle and actually rained on the inside of the building. It's because the building was so large, so much solar gain was being produced by that condition that you actually started getting precipitation. So what they wound up doing is painting the top of the glass and blocking all the light. And of course the grass died. So what they wound up coming up with was this idea of AstroTurf, which allowed the players to play on this fake piece of grass and then kind of move forward. And I'm bringing this up because they're going to demo the Astrodome later in March, which is a question. But so what we're looking to do, this is a project for Senate for San Francisco, and we were looking to, it was a small kind of landscape near a highway and a road. It was a public project. And so what we were trying to do is actually create these extreme AstroTurf pockets that people could lie on like throw carpets. So that these could be things that people could then use, sit on, and become a part of, that actually manipulate the environment around them. This is just a kind of prototype of it. The fact that these became these kind of plastic nubs that you could run your hands on that had lighting below. These were actually a metallic plastic that had heating filament running through it. So these actually gave off a small degree of warmth. So you could actually lay upon these while the light was below you. They had a series of conditions, so whether or not it was just the thermal conditions, these were noise canceling devices, so that while you're sitting in the cars with the roads around you, you could actually create a little microclimate that was both thermal, sound, and light that allowed you to actually be in a little pocket that you could recline on, even though maybe the sound or the temperature or the light around you was not ideal. And so these, if you have the three carpets, spatially speaking, these spaces are more similar than these, even though what you see in terms of the geometry of the rugs versus the spaces they produce are not necessarily coincident. Shape geometry and energy don't necessarily mean the same thing. And so one thing I want to kind of touch on a little quickly here is the kind of reciprocal player in all this. So we're talking about energy, we're talking about the use of energy, we're talking about how it becomes a material. But a huge part of it is that your body can't respond to a material unless it can recognize the material. So when you're in the environment, any kind of signal gives you an indication of what's out there. And this is just a New York Times, New Yorker article, a little cartoon which basically said on evolution. I was wondering when you noticed there's a lot more steps. The idea that where we are today in terms of evolution, whether it's natural or artificial, is actually an ongoing progression forward. And this has become intriguing because when we think about the relationship of the human body and architecture, we think, whether we do it purposefully or not, we think all the way back to the Vitruvian man or maybe Korg's modular man. But essentially, you're thinking about the surface of the body. And a lot of knowledge went into making this, right? So Palladio came up with this idea of the modular man. It wasn't really until Leonardo started cutting up cadavers legally and trying to understand how the body came together and how muscles and ligaments and what was connected to what and how it all came together to create the kind of envelope that we had. The entire part of this, though, point of this is that it's really all about proportions. It's all about the skin. So, in terms of architecture, when we think about architecture, we think of the body. That skin of the body has a reciprocal player, which is the skin of the envelope of the building. Right? So when we think about model proportions, we're only thinking about our relationship to the geometries of the skin that create the spaces that we're in. The height of that door, the width of that door, how I pass through here, how far I can recognize that as an edge. So there's kind of, in a weird way, a collusion between recognizing the human skin as an envelope and the bodies of the buildings that we're in, whether it's a tent structure, whether it's concrete, stone. Those become skins that then house the bodies. But we also know that what's going on now, why this kind of works really well with the relationship of energy, is that the human body is actually changing artificially. So it's kind of been said and known that this is really an intriguing point in time in history for human physiology, because within our lifetimes, doctors, if they were, so much of what we've been doing as doctors and as people is that trying to bring someone who has a deficiency or born with a birth defect back to a kind of predetermined notion of what's normal, like what's average. So if you're born deaf or blind or couldn't see color, or had some neurological issues, the idea was that the body was then treated to bring back to a normal condition, right? So whether it's glasses, to contact lenses, to now LASIK surgery, to everything from the fact that you're vaccinated. The fact that we take vaccines to get rid of disease, antidepressants, hormonal drugs, testosterone treatment. These are all things that we do within our bodies to actually see beyond our natural condition. And this is a kind of period in history, really, where for the first time, doctors will have to choose to stop. So when you go and you get LASIK surgery, what you're getting isn't the latest technology, it's what they stop at, so they don't exceed any further. Right? That's why right now in terms of bodybuilding, you have two different bodybuilding. You have, I don't know what it's called, Mr. Universe, and then you have the non-drug induced bodybuilding. So you have the ones where everyone knows everyone's on steroids, and they look huge, and everyone pays a lot of money, and you have the people who are basically all natural and look a lot thinner and smaller. But it's a kind of schism, and you're starting to find this in sports medicine as well, where discussions of whether or not people should be treated or amplified. And so the human body is quite literally getting to the point now where the doctor has to choose, or more or less has to make a decision on when to stop. And so if we start thinking about this, with the human senses, what we see on the left-hand side, this is the idea of the sensorial envelope, in the sense that what you see is really, what you experience in space is really the sensory perceptions that we have. The fact that you're having more difficult time now seeing the people next to you, whether it's vision, auditory, taste, smell, thermoreception, which is basically change in temperature, right? Our skin is not a thermostat. We can't define, I can't tell you specifically what temperature it is in here. Your skin can only tell you a rate of change. It can only tell you when it went from colder to higher, but it didn't tell you an absolute temperature. The idea of pain and balance, it's really kind of unclear. You can go from 5 senses to up to 9 senses, depending on how you want to define them. And on the right-hand side are artificial senses, and then senses that we don't actually have anything in relationship to, whether it's sonar, seeing beyond the sort of human spectrum. But as strange as these things sound, there are no shortage of people working on these. Scientists who are actually realizing that our receptors in our bodies are actually much more nimble and plastic than we ever thought. Meaning if you can actually tap beyond the receptors you have and go straight into your central nervous system, you can actually teach your body to perceive new senses, like echo relocation. So the central nervous system, and what I'm trying to get at here is that this becomes part of the variable. Right now, the projects that I've been showing you are really about the senses that we have today. But the kind of great collusion that exists here is the fact that if the purple here are the energies that you create, which are gradient, and these are the human bodies, the real shape that comes about is how the body senses space and the relationship between that information and what the body perceives. So the shape of energy, the shape of space, is really about the collusion between what our bodies can perceive and what we can do with energy. And some of this is a little far off, but it certainly doesn't mean that it's not a viable option. So historically, when we think about the human body, means that you don't have a data anymore. It's not about knowing the body and then making architecture meet those needs. If the body's not static and can change, and the energies you work with can be manipulated, you get this feedback mechanism where both the architect and the body are both in conversation with them. And when that becomes a kind of intriguing moment, because you're no longer going down a linear path, you're going down a kind of back and forth. One can actually always inform the other. So you start essentially getting kind of arms race between the two. Without spending much time on this, I'm just going to talk about, this is just the shape of energy, more explicitly. And we talked about one of the kind of intrinsic qualities about this. So if we talk about the street light, as an example, so you have a street light, it's a full moon, you have a certain amount of lumens coming out of that light, it's coming down, it's creating a boundary, it's going to give you a particular boundary based on the moon, or any outside light, right? You see that boundary, the distance, or the kind of intensity between the light that hit here and the light that goes out there, it's going to have a characteristic. Go to a new moon, where you're going to get a lot less light, and all of a sudden that boundary is less distinct. So it's the same thing with a campfire. If you have a certain amount of heat, and a certain amount of wood, and it's at 32 degrees outside, you're going to have a particular boundary which is warm and has a certain amount of light. If the temperature drops down to 25 degrees, that boundary is going to get smaller because the temperature on the outside is actually forming it. So you have two options. You either just allow that space to get smaller, or you throw more wood on. If you throw more wood on, it's going to get brighter. So when you start having this is basically to show that this is the architecture, and X is the exterior environment pushing on it, and that's the shape you get of energy being created, a space. If X, the environment around you, gets more intense, it's going to make the architecture smaller. So what requires to happen here is either one needs to get more intense, and you accept that your space got smaller, or as architecturally as we know, a lot of spaces that we use, we can't afford for them to get smaller or bigger or whatever, you have to control them. It just means that energy output, much like that log, is going to have to get brighter, which means the physical characteristics, qualities, the effects of that architecture are going to change to hold it. So it's not a lot like when we're thinking again of the geometric, where it's basically ossified energy, it's closed and it's locked down. When you talk about energy, whether it's the analogy of the streetlight or campfire, you're talking about things that are going to go back and forth. So this is just a project that I was working on now in Chicago. This is an existing plaza. This is what the idea of architecture, if someone said, what's the geometry or what's the kind of form of the project, I would basically say that it's just an ingrained cut piece of metal system that basically lays flat on the ground. Below that are two large circular vents. One is actually moving air, air that's actually treated thermally, as well as some chemical and sound manipulation, and then a vacuum that actually pulls the majority of it back in. But the idea being that it's all below ground, but the actual shape, the aesthetic that you get in an architectural space is actually this kind of movement of air that then gets pulled back down, recycled, and pulled back up. So then within the Chicago months, the idea within this plaza is that you can move through it when it's turned off, much like any other light, that people can simply move through it. As the months go on, or as the time goes on, you want to turn it on, it actually produces a kind of quality. And that shape and that quality is going to change depending on the time of day, the time of year, and the pressure that's being pushed upon it. The idea is, of course, always to kind of keep a particular boundary, but more or less we're always kind of realizing that the form and the shape that we give that energy is actually going to be somewhat variable, but also potentially more flexible. And that's the trade-off. Some would say that it's actually less controllable, but the flip side is that's more upgradable. I mean, you can actually change that more quickly than you would, say, a larger kind of tent structure. And then again, the idea of where these boundaries are. So geometrically speaking, these people don't have what we would define as a wall separating them, but in terms of the environmental interior, this becomes a different space than where she is on the exterior. And these boundaries and how they sense those two start to create these differences of interior versus exterior, or however you want to define that kind of terminology. So again, the idea is not simply to look at this energy just for the sake of changing one material for the other. It's quite literally to say that what if if we just go from the idea of a corridor to a circle, necklace circulation, that didn't come quickly. That came from a lot of social pressure being pushed on. The definition of what interior is, the definition of interior changed over those centuries. But it also created a huge kind of social implication of how you organize space. And so I don't stand here telling you that I know the answers of what sort of organizationally using energy as a shape is going to produce. But the idea being that if we can both pique the imagination of what energy can be, the fact that it doesn't simply have to be a fuel. So when we think about the shape of energy now, we tend to point to solar panels, wind turbine. We point inside, we point to mechanical ducts. These become the kind of emblematics of what energy is, the kind of symbols of a fuel, the thing that kind of pushes it out. And instead, if we start thinking of energy and giving it shape, can it be something that people want? Can it be something that people covet? People that actually demand? And if we as architects we start thinking about energy like this, kind of speculating on the possibilities, then the kind of conversation outside of us, people who are actually looking at the technology, people who are actually developing the batteries, developing the solar panels, developing the efficiency of geothermal, these people can then have the pressure upon them, both politically as well as professionally, to actually make these changes happen. So for me, the role of the architect here, using energy, is that we can actually explore the possibilities of what we can do with it if it becomes more than simply fuel. It actually becomes something that people want, both aesthetically, organizationally, and in terms of that kind of value. So the kind of tongue-in-cheek version of it, Yves Klein's fire column just goes on the end of this, where we have the different orders that kind of created architecture from the Doric to the Ionic to the Corinthian as orders of architecture. Can we start thinking of Yves Klein's fire column, the use of energy, as just another move forward in the progression of the materials that we use for architecture? And then this is the book through Lars Mueller that comes out next month. I should point out, I mentioned to show this to some friends, and they thought it was a giant no croquis book that was this big. It's truth, it's a little smaller. It's not life size. And go. There.
So I have a question and comment. So one thing, if you eventually need to create an exterior skin, right? Because you need to create shelter inside for architecture. And what they suggest is that that skin might be flexible and might be able to adjust based on what the energy and the material inside is creating. And if you take the current model, which can kind of be drawn as a pyramid, right, where you have the bottom layer is your active systems, and then you have passive systems, and then the tip top of it is architectural form or shape. It's today less important than everything else because with your active systems you can change everything. And current discussion says that we should move back to a mirror image of that, where the bottom layer is your architectural form or shape, which creates everything, and then you have your passive systems, and then the end system is your active system, which means that you only use that if your form is not giving you what you need.
Right.
I wonder how this fits into that discussion, because now we're talking about a skin that needs to be very sophisticated, right, to respond. So active systems in terms of envelope creating become really important.
So, yes. And I guess the way I would see it would be that right now the way you're describing that is that I think in some ways there's a big disjuncture there between the bottom of the pyramid and the top of the pyramid, in the sense that one agenda is the form and shape that you want your architecture to be, and then the other is whether it's passive or generative that actually produces or meets the requirements necessary. And there's a kind of schism between the two, because they're not having the same dialogue. So maybe it's the stacked duck and the stuffed pig, in the sense that you have a different agenda with form and shape that comes from geometry, and then anything in terms of fueling that is a different discussion, and it becomes different people have to figure out how to get that thing to work. Like, I haven't figured out all of this, that, and the other. That wasn't a generative approach to it. Like it doesn't become the motivator for the shape. So, in a couple of projects that I've shown, so it's a little example. I think the projects that way for me, and in the book kind of fall into two categories. One is which with the geometry and the surface are still present, and they actually are helping to generate the energy, and in a weird way, they are the less interesting part of my project. So that they're not where I want to put my money and my effort. What I want to do is when I can harness that energy, what do I then do with it? And that becomes my shape. So that Noli plan, like for me, those shapes are how I would want to describe that project. So if someone went to that project and said it's a bunch of floor plates off the ground with pyramids, that may be the kind of technique that was deployed, but the shape that gives it an architectural potential is really those energies that move through it. And that last project is probably where I want to go more, which is actually trying to get rid of. I don't have a thing against geometry. It's not like an intrinsic, I'm not allergic to it, I'll get a rash when I work with it. But I do think, like in that case, the idea of how far can I run with that where I don't need to move the surface in? And if I do, it'll be because it's helping me get that vision across. So this becomes what I'm shooting for. And if geometry needs to start coming in here, so one of the things we're working with now is actually ramping up here to the edges, just on a few sides that come up 18 inches, just so it can potentially hold that spin a little longer. But so every time that geometry comes in, it's coming in to facilitate that shape, not a shape that the surface is going to then be applied to. So in the same way, it's kind of working backwards, whether it's the kind of geometric and then working the passive and generative to make that thing feasible and convince somebody it's worth building. There's not going to, you're going to have huge energy bills. This is in a weird way the other way. Like, I want to do this, and if I need to bring in some more surfaces to make it plausible, I'll do it. But this is really what I'm looking for. And the work that we're doing, which I haven't mentioned, is that seating system. The office is an architectural office, and we started off doing a lot more competitions and approaches. But I split off the second company called Climate Design, which is doing nothing but technological work. So we're just trying to figure out how we can make that and how we're going to actually bring in investors through climate design to actually get the funding and grants. And this becomes a conversation because architecturally speaking, no one wants to invest in a first off project. No one's going to say, we haven't done that before, but I'm willing to take a risk on you. Like, that doesn't happen too often. So instead, by going through the climate design, we can actually go for federal grants, we can actually get local, state grants. And again, this idea that energy is a $17 trillion industry is that there's a lot more money when you start working with energy. So the technological side is to try to start figuring out now the kind of mechanisms that will then allow us to go back and forth. So a lot of the work is actually either larger scale installation, larger scale competitions where we're trying to figure out the kind of larger spatial implications for city and urban moves on building scale, and then working on smaller scale with this, where we can actually start figuring out the technological possibilities that will allow us to fail, work, and then feedback into bigger projects.
In what you just said, like the idea of optimization, that it's something that maybe in the field and in kind of the discourse that's kind of building up and talking about atmospheres, you're talking about the shape of energy, but maybe there are other discourses that talk about atmospheres or thermodynamics, and it has some point in contact. Well, at least I see that they're different or parallel, but they have some stuff in common. But what you just said, I was wondering, what is your view when you design the shape that you call shape? You're designing something that, in itself, it has an intention. I mean, it's not an optimal environment. It's optimal to your intentions, but it's not that it's a comfort zone or something. It's a project that tries to do something. But then the geometry that has to surround it has to be optimal to that somehow. So there is an optimization of some sort. And I don't know, I see these kind of dichotomies in different kind of moments, like this one about trying to optimize something that's based on something that's not optimal in itself. I'm not saying that it's something that I have a problem about. It's just like to see what you think about it, or how synthetic it becomes. Like the break of the materials become much more synthetic so that they can achieve the demands that you want to kind of I don't know, to offer, but it, like, everything becomes not a natural material, but something that you have to produce the material and to produce it in a certain way. It's like more plastic-based, maybe. And how do you see that the energy to produce those materials is something that it's not optimal either? Like, how do you see this circle? You know what I mean? Like, I understand that to kind of propose the new paradigm of how this would work, you have to kind of go through a lot of, you know, back and forths about this. But how do you see that as an issue, you know, like the optimization of the material and the shape and how it has, I don't know, to me it has some sort of open ends.
Yeah, well, it goes, I think I maybe make the analogy in the sense that it's not a lot different than working in terms of geometry. So if we're going to talk about Louis Kahn says, what does a brick want to be? Like, he didn't actually, I think, produce like that, but that's the kind of analogy working out. It's just like, what does steel or concrete want to be? Obviously, they have performance criteria. One stacks really well, and one actually has tension and works in a very different way. So there are performative properties laid within them that I think you have to respect. So if you're working with thermodynamics, you're working with air velocity, you're working on cooling something or heating something, and how much of that gets dissipated and lost versus how much of it can be returned. All these things are part of the conversation. But I think what I'm trying to overcome is the truth of a material. Like, I don't really care about that. Like, I don't really think that I want to show the truth of energy, because I think if you go down that road, I don't know what the truth of energy is. I mean, energy created Earth. I mean, like, it can go in a lot of directions. But most importantly, the idea, and it's a good question because it touches on a lot of points. One question is that for so long, at least, we were talking about school earlier, when I was in school 10, 15 years ago, so much of it was about the justification of means to end. And at some point when it comes to working with energy, I have to know the general principles that allow me to think that this is feasible. The same way that if you work with geometry, you need to know a 2/3, 1/3 relationship, more or less, for a cantilever. You don't know exactly how you're going to spec that out, but if you're working with a 2/3, 1/3, you have more or less a rough idea that you can make that cantilever. Then you'll go back and figure it out. When it comes to energy, I think what we need more of that is a similar generalization, where you know how far you can go and when you're going beyond that. But in architecture, no one rarely says, I'm going to hold back on that and not go so far, because I don't know if I can figure that out. We don't do that. I mean, we go way too far, and then we pull back as we start building, as the budget comes in, as the numbers come in, as the next project comes in. We often go very far and then pull ourselves back in time. That's just what we do. But in energy, I guess my bigger issue is that we don't do that. You know, we have preconceived notions and we stick to them. And so I'm very much trying to figure out, as a designer, what is plausible. Like, what are the spaces that people can use? How can it be projected and used? And if I need to take some steps back to do it, then that's where I go. But does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, sure, yeah.
And then there definitely are different moves. And then I think I started off talking about, writing this book 5 years ago and finishing it now. I had different work, and I've learned things just from. That's actually, kind of an interesting topic within the book, is that by the time you get done, you kind of want to show images that represent the type of work you're doing and what it looks like. But at the same time, you know that what you did 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, doesn't represent everything that you want to go. So I show this as the last one because this is probably closest to where I want to go. If I show you a tool or some other projects where they kind of came from, they're more geometrically based. That still have energy as a huge component, meaning how you organize a site that grows as you use a system. It's a library with a huge double stained glass system. So generally double stained glass is about getting heat and bringing it back in. What if you supersized it and got that heat and put it back out to the environment? And that was the mechanism for this. So it's really funny when I go talk in landscape architecture. If I talk in architecture, people want to know where the building is. And when I go into landscape architecture, they'd say it's too much landscape architecture. I'm told there's too much architecture there. So it's this kind of weird dichotomy. I'm applying for work, applying for jobs, or giving lectures where One group thinks there's not enough of it, and the other group thinks there's too much of it. And so these, in any way, are still emblematic of the ideas, but I really, all the time, is trying to start splitting back the stuff and trying to get to what I think is closest to the project, which is trying to give the shape to the energy systems and not relying on the geometries as the kind of signifiers or the kind of footnotes that are sticking around. So a little bit like at the end of the surface question is like they do come back, but I almost start with the 2/3 cantilever and say I want to do it out of inner material, and I'll figure out at that point where I pull back.
How do you find the balance between the effect that you want and the amount of energy required to get that? Is it still waiting on technology to make it in an efficient way, or I guess just some question of how much energy is required to get an effect, and how can you get a balance of energy required for this?
And so it really is always a kind of back and forth. So this was just a project I didn't show, but I'm trying to give this one that computational CFD simulations. And these were things in which we did run them and test them to see how they all worked. And the idea was that each one of them, the 6 of them, are all geometrically identical, but each one between the dyed chemical water, there's a fan in here, there's vegetation, there's a heating element, and then there's lighting systems. And the idea between those 5 variables was to actually create different microclimates in each one. So over the months while this was up, during the course of the day, it would turn on and turn off at different peaks. So we had one, I think this one on the far left one, which was the control, which had nothing in it except the box, and we could see how things were changing. And then the other ones were controlled. And the idea really behind them was to figure out, how can we start getting shapes on the inside and try to actually move that vapor up and move it as a kind of vortex on the inside and give shape to it. So in this sense, this was all kind of tested, trying to figure out the amount of heat given off by each piece, the velocity of the air, how it kind of came in contact with each other. As it comes to the larger scale projects, so this really went back into, you can't tell, but these have actually become giant trees. Are starting to actually take all the energy from the existing from this building and dump it, and heating and all that, and actually control it and use it on as a way of coming through the lungs of the building. I know I didn't talk about this one, but when we started getting to this scale, we stopped doing simulations because they were too complex. They were both complex, they were time-consuming, and it wasn't enough in terms of the competition to get the idea. So it's really around this time when I kind of took a break from that and came up with intentionalities, like things I wanted it to do, and took, again, general approaches to it, knowing that I could take the excess heat from all of the mechanical wood shops and metal shops that I had down here, all the mechanical systems that we tried locating down here, and dumping that energy into a soil, so that you could actually have, in Estonia, this is in Tallinn, to have, this is not outside, but it is controlled a little bit, and if it's possible, can we then use this as these kind of microclimates where people could be all year round as a public landscape, with the university on the top and a public landscape below. This would then be teamed up with Atelier 10 in New York, who are environmental system engineers. And then at this point, that's where we come with them and we start having conversations about like how can we instrument this? Like how far are we off on these numbers? Like where is this not working? So that kind of long list I showed at the beginning, we don't ever jettison that long list. That's still there. It's just that we try not to make energy just another subset of that list, but actually making it a generative mechanism and seeing what opportunities come about. Another project we had was an example of that was that we had a certain amount of square footage. We tried laying it out with this kind of large lung system, and our argument was that if you do this, we can actually collapse a couple of the programs on top of each other that are time-based, and we can cut off material by 10%. So we said we can make your building 10% smaller than you want if you do this project. So we're going to use that energy in a different way. We'll use that 10% probably in the systems, so that we can actually figure out spatially or organizationally what could potentially come from that. But we don't ever really get rid of that mindset. We just I mean, no one would ask me what steam system I'm using in the building at a competition level. They'd be like, yeah, I'll figure that out. I set performative requirements for that, and then I'll backtrack it. But so we're kind of thinking of energy in the same way. We're the kind of cantilever example where it's a rule of thumb logic where I think it's doable. Have I crunched the numbers yet in terms of like what steps we're going to have for you?
Do you find any resistance to that approach since energy, it's a little bit different than structure in that has gravity and something that's, you sort of know how it works, but energy is so fluid and moving and there's so many things that can influence it and change it, that make it, at least seem to me, more of an unknown. Is there resistance to kind of, like,
Yes.
I think it's great to do this, but what are the things you need to prove to people to accept that approach?
Well, that's a really good question. And so the answer to that is twofold. One is we're going to the kind of prototype company side, the technology side, so we can actually generate these and actually have show me times, like just show it working. And when you show somebody something, people have less questions because they're going to get taken in a bit quicker. And that's something we'll be a little late to get into, but we'll more. In terms of pushback, sure. I had a meeting at the mayor's office with the deputy mayor to show on that project, and they were with his energy specialist. And the question was like, that museum you pitched it to, we're trying to get them to get triple pane windows so they can get less heat out. And you want to tell me you want to build this thing? Like, he's like, I love the project, but the mayor's office can't stand behind your project. But at the same time, we're trying to get all the windows in Chicago to be like extra layers of insulation, and we're trying to reduce the lighting. So it's tough to tell somebody that there was a point in time when iron and steel was super expensive and you couldn't do what we do today. But costs came down, technology improved, and new advancements took forward. So it's difficult to tell somebody that, yes, this may be expensive right now, or it may be a PR nightmare because someone's going to say you're dumping energy into the system. But if you can say to them, I can link this to the farmers markets, what happen every weekend, but stop on November 1st. If I can get those going for 10 more weeks, and I can make it, or I can increase Millennium Park and bring more concerts down and get more people into the park systems. Can I do a cost analysis and tell you that I'm actually going to give more back to the city by spending this? No one complains anymore that we waste street energy to light the streets. If we turn those things off, we'd be mad. You wouldn't have sports, you wouldn't have recreation, you wouldn't, So the question is, how do you get that, how can you produce a value to it that for us as architects is aesthetic, we call it aesthetic and organizational, but for the government or for the governing body that is maybe more economic. And if you can have that conversation back and forth, then you can slowly your agenda in a little bit. So I got kind of sniper fired at that meeting. We're not thinking all the way through, but we're still going for it. Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Before we even get going, I just want to say thanks both to the university for having me down here, but even more specifically to Nicole Michelle, because of all you've been a great host for everything here, so thank you very much. So what I want to talk about today is this is a project that I've recently done. It's a book called Air from the Planets. It is more or less, I don't want to say it's manifesto, but it's the idea that I'm trying to put forward, an idea which kind of links last 10 years of design projects and an interest always in writing. So for maybe as a discussion, maybe more with the students here too, is that as an architect, much of my work is as much about writing as it is about trying to build. And this has always been kind of back and forth for me. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that by both writing and designing, I'm actually able to work on the same problem, but in different ways. It's like just different mediums, working in clay versus working in water versus. And by being able to do both the same, it kind of allows me to get a better grasp of what I'm interested in. So I didn't go forward writing this book because I knew everything I wanted to do. I just wanted to put it into writing. The idea was that it was a kind of objective. And then by researching it, I kind of learned more about the bigger idea. And the kind of bigger idea that I'm talking about is this idea of physical boundaries. So in the most mundane way, I think everyone can describe what architecture is to them in different ways and what architecture means. But for me, really, at the end of the day, architecture is really about how we define physical boundaries and how we make those boundaries. Because those boundaries, depending on what material we use, what techniques we use for representing them, do two things. They will do many things, but the main thing that we associate them with is that they organize space, right? So we decide that by creating a physical boundary, you know, that we have a dimension of how big that is. It's probably a living room, maybe a den, kitchen, entry, bathroom. And those boundaries organize both the physical spaces, but they also organize social agendas. They have aesthetics to them. They have shape and form. So everything about that boundary, in the most simple way, how you draw a wall, how you draw any type of edge, is loaded with so many other things. And so this is an artist who has a piece here where obviously this is probably a domestic house. It has boundaries, but it doesn't have walls that we associate with architecture. So you may look at it in terms of dimensions, say this is a private house, but in terms of the boundaries that are necessary for this individual to be able to use this as a bedroom, obviously it's a completely different project. So those boundaries become rather important. And what interests me most about all this is looking at this is that the conversation of the air front of planets is really a question of using energy as a building material. So raising the question of how can we start thinking of energy and the discussion of energy, a discussion that essentially, if you want to think of the biggest economy, market, investment that's going on in the world right now, it's a discussion of energy. So as architects realize that energy is a $17 trillion a year world economy, you realize that it's not something that's just an economy that architects are part of, but it's also a resource that we have to be aware of, things we're dealing with, how we define our spaces, the environment it's a part of. It's a huge, much larger conversation. But what I'm going to try to get to is using the idea of energy and talking about energy not just as something that conditions the interior of a building, or is the light or energy that bounces off the outside of the wall, but actually becomes a building material. The same way that we think about concrete, glass, steel, what have you. These are moments in which we've come up with new materiality, we've had new spatial dimensions because of that. Social revolutions, architectural new shapes and aesthetics. But to kind of get this as an idea that when we do think about, this is just called where program boxes go to die, is we can't sort of underestimate how much we talk about, when we think about architecture, we think about geometries and surfaces. So whether you're in first year sketching, doing everything by pencil and pen, whether you're in your last year education or professional, working in Rhino, Maya, building in a foam model, working in chipboard, everything you do is really an abstraction of a surface. And that surface creates a shape, right? But we don't ever think about the energies around us. We don't think about microclimates. We don't draw in gradients. We always draw with lines. And to give you an idea, these are two different examples. One I'm calling the stacked up, and one I'm calling the stuffed thick. So the stacked up, these are A, B, C, D. These would be like program boxes. So whether you're working on a program, you're doing a theater, someone says you need an entrance theater, you need a lobby, bathrooms. These all become programs that, in one sense, just become little boxes of program, right? And then you stack those programs together, and you create a shape that comes from all the ideas of these little things that come together. So if you want to make an analogy, this is probably, the stacked up is a lot like looking at an East Dutch office now that's working in the Arcade Eagle, Julian de Schmidt, even some work at OMA and Koolhaas. This idea of basically working in program boxes that then give you an idea of something as a singular thing that gets stacked to make a bigger shape. The flip side of that is the stuff big. Again, surfaces, where if you want to start thinking an analogy in architecture, offices that are someone like Greg Lynn or Zaha Hadid or UN Studio, people who basically are working with a bigger surface, They come up with an idea for the shape of the building, and then like a cut and eat, they chop it into pieces and say that's going to be my entrance, that's going to be my theater, that could be my core, my courtyard, my mechanical system. But really the driving force is the shape itself first, and then you cut it up. The other one is you come up with a lot of smaller components, and together it comes together as one large thing. The reason I'm showing this though is because if someone basically said, Bjarke Ingels, OMA on one hand, and Greg Lynn, Zaha Hadid on the other, you would immediately start thinking these are polar differences, right? These are very different people working in architecture, right? But in truth, I'm basically saying that they're very similar actually, because they're both working with surfaces as their main mechanism for organizing space. And you can't really underestimate just how ingrained that is in everything we do. So to give you another moment here, this is pink line is basically what I'm saying is architecture today. Architecture is a form of mediation. So this is something that Rainer Banham talks about, if you're familiar with him as a writer, an English writer. And basically, again, this idea of that line, so whether it's the stuffed pig or the stacked duck, there's a geometry, so looking at this wall here, there's a geometry, a line that you draw abstractly, which basically just has all the conversation with the environment around it. It's an act of mediation. So whether it's, you want to call it postmodernism, modernism, Gothic, Neo, whatever, it basically does 2 or 3 things. It either allows energy to pass through, like a brise-soleil, like a, well, not a brise-soleil for the lake, but like a porch, or it allows things to bounce back. So it removes that stuff like rain to actually not come in, or like an adobe structure or a parking garage that allows that heat and concrete to say, essentially become internalized, meaning the energy gets absorbed by the piece. But everything, that line, that geometry is doing all that work, and this becomes the space inside, and that's the space outside. So what I'm interested in trying to think about is, when we talk about energy, we're at a really unique point in time here, because energy is such a large industry, but it's also the thing that we take the most conservatively, meaning we generally think about creating a box, and then we find a way to cool it or heat it, but we don't really think about what we're doing with the energy beyond that. So the idea of architecture as an amplification is actually saying, what if we think of energy not as the thing that fills the inside of the box already, so you make a building. That's it. You've already decided the organizational structure of this building. You know where you're going to come in, you know where you're going to leave, you know where the light's going to come in, and then you use energy as a way of just filling it up, so we can accommodate it in terms of ideal temperatures. So instead, if you think of amplification, what if we actually take those energies and use them to actually build space itself, like microclimates? And I'll talk more about this, but it's essentially saying, what if architecture gives shape